Hello, I'm Bill Carnes, talk show host and commentator on Republic Broadcasting Network. As Americans, we like to think that our system of government provides for openness and transparency. After all, these are the hallmarks of a free nation. Over the last several years, in particular, we've repeatedly been assured that our government will be more transparent and above board. Laws have been passed aplenty that are ostensibly to provide us the ability to see behind the curtain and thus have a better idea of what government is doing in our name. But is that really happening? Is the government revealing everything that we may want to know, or is it revealing only what it is willing to let us see and no more? For most Americans, the most direct contact we have with the federal government is during the income tax season between January and April of each year. Every year, the working Americans dutifully file returns and pay income tax. We've been socialized since birth that we are required to do so. Death and taxes. But who is it among us who have actually read the tax code? Not publications, pamphlets, or tax form instructions, but the actual law. The answer to that is clearly, virtually no one. One man has read the tax law in detail for nearly 2 decades. For the past 17 years, Dave Champion has been a champion in what is known as the tax honesty movement. A movement that contends that the government has not been truthful, has not been transparent with the American public about the limited scope and reach of the income tax. Now, certainly spending one's time learning about the federal tax codes is not what most people would choose to do with their time. But Dave Champion is clearly not most people. Dave is a former U.S. Army Airborne Ranger with a law enforcement background, as well as having been a business owner in the private sector since the mid-1980s. In 1993, Dave was first introduced to the tax honesty movement. His shock, surprise, and indignation at what he contends the government is doing led him to become one of the leading experts in the world concerning the true constitutionally limited scope of the income tax. Dave has recently taken 17 years worth of experience in the tax honesty movement and written his first book, Income Tax, Shattering the Myths. Today I sit down with Dave as we discuss his book. Dave, your book. What is Income Tax, Shattering the Myths about?
Income Tax, Shattering the Myths tells the truth in a very dynamic and positive way for the very first time in the history of the income tax about who the income tax actually applies to and who it does not. It explores the constitutional boundaries of the income tax, and it doesn't explore it in some esoteric legal sense. It explores it with concrete, hard proof and evidence, virtually all of it from the United States government.
In your book, you use the phrase tax honesty movement. Can you explain that a little bit?
For years, the United States government has referred to anybody who doesn't follow its party line as tax protesters. But as the readers will find in the book, that's not remotely true. You remember the civil rights movements of the 1960s?
Certainly.
The tax honesty movement is the civil rights movement that doesn't pertain to black folks or Hispanic folks. It pertains to every single American, all 308 million of us. And the civil right we're talking about is our liberty and our property rights. And the tax honesty movement is millions and millions of Americans who believe the United States government, through its Treasury Department and the IRS and the courts and Congress, should actually obey and comply with its own laws and not mislead 308 million Americans improperly to believe that the income tax applies to millions of Americans to whom it does not factually, legally apply.
So with that in mind, do you see yourself as the Rosa Parks of sorts for the tax honesty movement?
I hadn't actually thought about it that way. I'm just pleased and I'm honored that somebody, in this case it happens to be me, has the ability to tell this truth to the American people.
Dave, you said a moment ago that your book tells the truth about the income tax. With all the other books out there on income tax, how is yours the one that just tells the truth? Isn't that a bit presumptuous?
It may seem that way. However, the United States government has been involved for about 40 or 50 years now in misleading the American public about what the income tax pertains to. Most books that are written about the income tax are written by people in the tax industry. And there's nothing wrong with the income tax or the tax industry. What is the problem is the misleading of the American public as to whom it actually applies and to whom it does not apply. So this book is the very first time, and the research has been out there for years. I've just been blessed to be in a position to accumulate it all and have the acumen to actually produce it in a book. It tells the truth about what the government's known all along, and that is that the income tax doesn't apply to the vast majority of Americans. It just happens to be the first time we've had the ability to put it all in one place, in one single compendium, and tell that entire story.
So with that in mind, why did you write the book? Who's your real target audience?
The target audience is every single American in this country, because the issue of our rights, what Thomas Jefferson called our inalienable rights, one of which is the right of property. And I just read a wonderful book called Endless Money, in which the author says that the 16th Amendment, typically called the Income Tax Amendment, did away with the property rights of Americans. Well, the author simply didn't understand what the 16th Amendment truly did. And we still have all of our property rights intact, and the United States government knows that. The United States Department of Justice knows that. The White House knows that. Congress knows that. But they've been able to buffalo the American people into believing something that is not legally or constitutionally accurate, and convince Americans to participate in a system, to voluntarily go out and participate day in and day out in this thing called the income tax system, when in fact most Americans are not obliged to participate at all.
Now, Dave, I've read your book, and you actually have a precursor early on in the book that explains that you are not an attorney or an accountant. What qualifies you to write on this matter?
In one sense, nothing. In another sense, everything. Let me explain that. We have come to the point in our society where we've almost become a technocracy. What that means is we feel that we can't govern anymore, that we have to rely on experts in every field. Look at global warming as an example. Is it really happening? Well, the average citizen says, well, I don't have the answer. I'll have to defer to the experts. Well, the same thing is true with the income tax. It's so complex for most people and confusing that they defer to the experts. But the experts are certified as experts by the United States government. The very people who are propagating the myths, who are misleading 308 million Americans, are the same people who certify the experts. So when people write books on the income tax, it tends to be exactly what the government wants them to write. For instance, I've often said I live near Las Vegas. If UNLV School of Law were to hire me to teach a course on tax law, I probably wouldn't be there 2 weeks before the state of Nevada, at the urging of the federal government, most specifically the Treasury Department, would be contacting UNLV and saying, if you keep Mr. Champion on staff teaching something opposed to what we say the income tax is, then we're going to pull your law school's accreditation. That's how they keep the myth propagated, that kind of power conduct. The truth is, the income tax is complex, but it doesn't need to be complex. And after spending almost 2 decades looking at the law, I have been able to, thankfully for the purpose of the book, distill the concepts of the income tax, its history, its judicial history, its legislative history, even the things the IRS itself has said about the income tax, down to positions that each and every American can understand. They can read it, they can say, I understand what was just said. And when you line that all up and they read the book from beginning to end, they'll say at the end, I get it, I understand. Yes, it's complex, but it's not that complex, and now I understand.
Now, some of the other people in the tax honesty movement, as we call it, have been non-government experts and have somehow found themselves wound up in federal prison for tax-related convictions. How do you explain the difference in their theories of tax honesty and your theories of tax honesty?
Because tax law is so complex, people, regrettably, have had a tendency to try to devise their own explanations rather than looking at what the law actually says. And that's gotten a lot of people in trouble. And unfortunately, the United States government, with the complicit assistance of the dominant media, have been able to some extent, paint a picture that because some people in the tax honesty movement have been mistaken, that the entire premise of the tax honesty movement is mistaken. And of course, that's an absurd position. People go to jail concerning the income tax predominantly for 2 reasons. Number one, they've actually participated in the system. They've said again and again throughout the year on numerous forms, they've sworn under penalty of perjury, I am a taxpayer. And then at the end of the year, they say, well, I'm not a taxpayer. The law, tax law, doesn't work that way. The second reason so many people go to jail is that the 12 people sitting in the jury box don't understand income tax. All they understand is, well, I file my returns and I pay my tax. So if the man sitting at that defense table didn't do that, he needs to be convicted and he needs to go to jail. Wouldn't it be fantastic if everybody who were to sit on a jury had already read Income Tax, Shattering the Myths, so when they sat on the jury, they would say, I know that man is not required under federal law to file an income tax return or pay income tax. The tax has never been imposed on him. And because I've read the book, I know that. Acquitted.
So are you then advocating that all Americans stop paying income tax?
Well, I wouldn't say all Americans, because there are a small percentage of Americans that are actually liable for the income tax. The tax has been imposed upon them, or they have otherwise been made liable. But that's a very small percentage of the population. What I'm suggesting is that the vast majority of Americans read the book. It takes this complex subject and distills it down to something they can truly understand, and then make a decision whether they want to continue to participate in what I describe in the book as the largest financial crime in the history of the world. If they would like to continue to participate in that, I guess that's a choice for all of America to live with. I'm hoping that they'll make another choice.
So Dave, some people perceive what they would consider a dramatic change, a dramatic consequence, if there's a change in the income tax system, or more so even the lack of Americans paying into it. How would you respond to that?
Over the last 20 some odd years, most of the comments I've heard from people pertain to things like fire, police, schools. And none of those are funded by income tax. For instance, your fire and police, they're typically funded by a combination of property tax and sales tax. Schools are almost exclusively property tax. And these things vary state to state, but they're all paid for by taxes within your state. Income tax is not involved in that at all. I also hear people say, well, who will build the roads? Well, your state roads are built by the state portion of the tax you pay each time you buy a gallon of fuel at the gas station. Same thing with federal roads. They're built by the taxes that you pay with each gallon of fuel at the gas station. So your roads are going to be there, your schools are going to be there, your police protection is going to be there, your fire protection is going to be there. So what would be the consequence of not having an income tax? Well, it's a bit of a complex question, and for the sake of this interview, I'm going to limit it to what I covered it in detail in the book, but we'll look at it briefly here. The size of the United States government will, of necessity, be decreased. However, most people who've actually studied the Constitution, I don't just mean read it, I mean studied its history and what the founders had to say, what the Supreme Court had said before the New Deal era, we find that most of what the United States government is doing, the vast majority of what it's doing today, is outside the bounds of the Constitution, and frankly, makes it unconstitutional, and to apply another word, makes it criminal. It's against the law. So if the United States government were to actually have to live within the boundaries of the Constitution, I think that would be an excellent thing. I think there's millions of Americans that agree with me. Just recently I saw a poll that said 56% of the American public believes that the federal government has grown so large and so intrusive that it is, their quote, an immediate threat to the liberty of Americans. By America understanding the income tax and choosing to do the right thing and follow the law and no longer participate in the largest financial crime in the history of the world, we can reduce the size of the federal government back down to the point where 56% of Americans no longer have to feel it is an immediate threat to their rights.
So Dave, in follow-up, are you saying that if the income tax that's being paid now were no longer to be paid to the federal government, that amount of money would just be missing from the federal budget?
Not exactly. It's more complex than that, because the income tax that's collected is not a part of the federal budget. That's a misnomer on the part of the American public. The American public perceives that when they pay income tax, it goes into the Treasury of the United States, and then Congress uses it and appropriates it for various purposes, and then we, the American people, receive the benefits thereof. That is absolutely not true. During the Reagan administration, he impaneled a commission called the Grace Commission, and he posed 10 questions to them. One of them was, what happens to the income tax paid by the American public? The Grace Commission came back and said, not one penny of the income tax that is paid goes to fund services that the tax-paying public might imagine they should be receiving, but in fact, 100% of the income tax goes to pay the interest on the federal debt. So, if Americans were to follow the law, decide that their property rights are truly significant in their world, and stop participating in the largest financial crime in the history of the world, what would happen is the banks, the private banks that comprise the Federal Reserve, would no longer have a source to pay the interest on the existing debt. I think it's clear, we understand how bankers operate. If they're no longer being paid interest, they're certainly not going to be interested in extending any more credit. What this would mean is that instead of Congress funding every extravagant program, entitlement programs across the board, traveling to other planets, other universes, all these things that the Congress just waves its magic wand and makes happen, it does that by borrowing from the Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve were no longer to be willing to borrow, to lend at least those amounts, the federal government would have to decide, make some tough decisions, and live within its actual means. I think the best way to restore liberty to the United States and to all the people of the United States is for the federal government to be forced back to live within its means. Just like you have to live within your means, just like I have to live within my means, the federal government should have to live within its means.
Let's go into some of the legal points in the book. You said that most Americans are not U.S. persons, and that term is defined in the tax code. When I looked up the definition of U.S. person in the general definition sections of 7701A30, it says that a U.S. person is a citizen of the United States, a resident of the United States, or a U.S. corporation. Why then do you say that U.S. person does not include most Americans in your book?
7701A are general definitions for the entire code, the entire tax code. We're talking about income tax. Income tax is a very small part of the tax code. The tax code has something like more than 100 chapters. The income tax is a mere 3 chapters. So when we look at a general definition, we have to understand that it creates a broad category that's applicable to all sorts of various taxes that we're not talking about, either you and I today or in the book. When we isolate the meaning of U.S. person for the income tax and the income tax only, we find that it has a much more narrow meaning. And the meaning of a U.S. person for the purpose of the income tax, now remember, there's literally hundreds of other taxes in the tax code, and they have their own spin on the general definition. But when we come to income tax, it narrows substantially. So what we find is, yes, it's a U.S. citizen, yes, it's a U.S. corporation, and so forth. But for income tax purposes, there's a bunch of other folks that are U.S. persons that are not even mentioned in the general definition, such as agencies of the federal government, branches of the Federal Reserve. So the general definition has to be narrowed or expanded based on the exact type of tax we're talking about. And Congress and the Secretary of the Treasury and his regulations have, as far as you and I are concerned, have narrowed the definition for a U.S. person for the purpose of income tax to a U.S. citizen or a U.S. corporation that has received money from a U.S. source, income from a U.S. source, that belongs to a foreign person. That's the definition of U.S. person as applied to the income tax. The definition you gave me, and I understand completely where that's coming from, is the broad definition for the entire tax code. It's not limited to income tax.
So then, Dave, with that explanation, can you give me an example of a U.S. person as it applies to the income tax?
Certainly. Let's say somebody in Venezuela decides to invest money here in the United States. So they contact a U.S. investment firm, and they provide capital to that U.S. investment firm. That U.S. investment firm may then go out and acquire certain investments. And depending on how the arrangement is structured, the investment firm may hold those investments in its own name on behalf of the Venezuelan. When the investment sources pay out their interest or dividends to the investment firm, which is a U.S. company, the proceeds that are being paid out actually belong to the citizen of Venezuela who's living in Venezuela. So for the purpose of Subtitle A, which is what we all commonly call income tax, the financial firm is a U.S. person because it is receiving U.S. source income that actually belongs to a foreign person. Americans tend to be very straightforward. So they look at a form and they say, and it says U.S. person, and they say, well, I'm a U.S. citizen, so I guess I'm a U.S. person. Well, unfortunately, no one's ever told them law doesn't work that way. Law has very specific definitions. For instance, we're talking about the definition of U.S. person in the tax code. We've already discussed that it has a different meaning for Subtitle A income tax than it has for some other types of taxes in the tax code. Likewise, in international relations, laws passed by Congress dealing with international relations that have nothing to do with taxation, U.S. person has other meanings. In Title 50, dealing with war in the military, U.S. person has yet other definitions. So we have to be alert when we look at these legal terms. Most Americans aren't even aware there are legal terms. But we have to be alert when we look at these legal terms to the fact that they have specific, defined legal meanings for the application that Congress intended when they created that law. So for the purpose of the income tax, somebody looks at a form and they say, oh, U.S. person, I'm a U.S. citizen, that must be me, and they check that box. Sadly, because they don't understand how law works, they just certified under penalty of perjury that they are a person upon whom the tax has been imposed or otherwise made liable, when in fact that law has absolutely nothing to do with them. But they just swore to it under penalty of perjury solely because they don't have the information to know better. And that's one of the great things that why I feel so great about having written Income Tax Shattering the Myths. This gives every single American the opportunity to actually know, in language they can understand, what the law requires and doesn't.
With your explanation of the Venezuelan investor, let's stick with that for a moment. It sounds as though if they have an investment coming, that would be at the end of the year when they get their dividends from this investment, that they would be issued what we commonly refer to and know as a 1099. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
So then what would the purpose of a W-4 be that virtually all Americans fill out when they start new employment at a job?
We've shifted a little bit from income derived from capital investment to now we're talking about wages paid in the course of employment.
And I read this in Chapter 8. I found Chapter 8 to be particularly interesting because the conclusion of Chapter 8 is that most Americans are not subject to payroll withholdings, as we've been discussing. So I want you to talk about that for just a moment, especially when it comes to the differences. Okay, if we have a foreign investor that gets a 1099 at the end of the year for dividends, as opposed to a W-4 foreign employee, as it's defined in Chapter 8 of Income Tax Shattering the Myths.
Much like our dialogue we just had about U.S. person and the fact that it's a legal term and it has very specific, might I say, narrow definitions provided, the same thing is true when we get to the portion of the code dealing with payroll withholding. It uses language such as employee and wages. And again, Americans being good-hearted, very straightforward, they look at the word employee, they look at the word wages, and they say, I know what an employee is. I know what wages are. My wife goes to work and works for a local company. She's an employee. When she gets a paycheck, that's wages. And if we were reading Webster's dictionary, that would be true. However, just like U.S. person, Congress has provided very specific, narrow, limited definitions for employee and wages as those terms are used in the portion of the code dealing with payroll withholding. Most people, I think, will be shocked and probably angered when they actually read in the book what the narrow definitions are that Congress has used to tailor those words to just its limited purpose for the purpose of payroll withholding. And what they will find is that the terms employee and wages don't apply to the vast majority of ordinary Americans because they've been tailored so narrowly to apply to a specific, very narrow, small subset. And it's probably too broad a topic to get into in the interview, but I guarantee the readers that they will be shocked and probably appalled when they find out.
Now, to coin an old phrase, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. But it sounds as though what we're getting is Congress has the ability to change the definition of a duck, and therefore this pen could legally be defined by Congress as a duck. Is that what we're getting at?
Absolutely. The Congress does not redefine terms so dramatically as we just talked about with ducks and pens. However, they take words that most Americans know the meaning of from the Common English Dictionary. And then Congress says, well, we're going to change the meaning for the purpose of this law. And the United States Supreme Court has said in 3 separate cases that once Congress has applied its own definition, we are barred. We cannot go back to the dictionary for a definition. We can only use the congressionally provided definition.
As it pertains to the particular piece of legislation that they're defining it in?
Correct. Let me give you an example. Employee has several definitions throughout the code, and they're dramatically different. Some of them talk about life insurance salesmen. Others talk about exclusively government workers. Others talk about people who work for the railroad. But the term is just employee, and they have these dramatically different meanings. Now, most Americans are probably going to be shocked when they find out that a word that they believe they know absolutely the meaning of, when it comes to a law, they have no idea what that means until they go research it. And most Americans will probably think that that's a bit sneaky of Congress. And I understand why people think that. However, it's not really so much being sneaky as it is a legal mechanism by which Congress can tailor the application of its laws to meet its specific goals. The problem is not what Congress is doing. The problem is that nobody has ever told the average American citizen, these words that you know in English, that's not what they mean in the law, and you need to look up the meanings. If every American, say in high school, was given at least one semester of how to read law, 90% of these problems would go away.
Using the words of Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court, the book makes it crystal clear that the income tax falls within a constitutional category called excise taxes. Now, can you explain what an excise tax is and the effect of who it's applied to?
Whenever I'm asked a question such as, what is an excise tax? It really doesn't matter what Dave Champion might cook up that is an excise tax. It matters what Congress has said, what the courts have said, what the Constitution says. And the courts have consistently held that the word excise, as used within the United States Constitution, means a tax upon the exercise of a privilege. Now, many Americans may stop and think, what is a privilege? Well, let me give you a very simple definition. A privilege is anything that you are allowed to do by consent, that you do, by the consent of the government, that you do not have a right to do. So what that means is, for the income tax to apply to the average American has to be engaged in something that he has no right to do, and that he can only engage in by special permission of the government. Obviously, when a man or woman gets up in the morning, has a little breakfast, gets the kids off to school, and goes on to work, and works their 40, 50 hours a week, and brings home a paycheck, well, the United States Supreme Court has said that that's a right, that is not a privilege. So we have a tax that has been declared again and again and again to be an excise tax by, I might add, not just the judicial branch, but the legislative branch. Congress itself, Congress's attorneys have said that it is an excise tax, and the employees of the Treasury Department have said that it is an excise tax. So here we have this thing called the income tax, which has been said to be an excise tax, which then is a tax upon the exercise of a privilege. Well, when a man or wife goes off to work and earns a living and brings it home, there's no privilege. That's not by permission of the government. Let's say somebody owns, I don't know, a carpet cleaning company. And at night they go into businesses and they clean carpets, and at the end of the month they invoice their customers and they receive payment. In America, there's no privilege there. That is a right. The ability to work, be compensated for our efforts, that is an absolute right. And that's not according to me. That's according to the United States Supreme Court. So since those activities are rights, not privileges. How then can we say a tax that is well established to be a tax upon a privilege somehow applies to those activities or the money that we earn from those activities? Well, the fact of the matter is it just doesn't. And that's what people will understand through some detail as laid out in the book. And one of the reasons I felt so passionately about writing this book is that Americans don't understand. And because they don't understand, they are the victims of the largest financial crime in the history of the world. I would love to see 308 million Americans suddenly understand the truth and say, I'm not going to be a victim anymore. And be able to enjoy, without harassment, without fear, all of their rights, including their rights of property.
So Dave Champion, author of the book Income Tax Shattering the Myths, and your website?
www.taxrevolt.us. Very easy to remember. If Americans understand their rights and understand what's in this book, there may likely be a tax revolt in the U.S.
Very good. Now, this is a book nearly 600 pages long. It is not the lightest of reading, but it's not yet the heaviest of reading either. Some very interesting chapters I went through a couple of times to really try and understand this, and you'll be getting a phone call. Dave Champion, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.